space as an event. Any space that you inhabit has a beginning and an end. If you think about the space that you're occupying when you have a picnic in the park, you put down a blanket and that creates this space. You interact with it as though it was an indoor room. When you take that blanket up, that space goes away. You walk through that area and it no longer feels like indoor space to you. So we can create these very thin spaces that are still actually existent in the city. If a blanket can do it, then almost anything can create a space. And so that can be a really powerful intervention tactic. When we're looking at altering imaginaries, it's important to think about this as play, not shock. With modern mass media and postmodern mass media, shock gets ignored. People don't really pay attention to it anymore. But if you can make people think, if you can make people have an emotional, effective experience, that still gets through. So there's this kind of divider between the things that get ignored and the things that still actually reach people. Creating affordances in the city is one of the other kinds of invention that we can do. A lot of times affordances actually want to be invisible, as opposed to a lot of the other sorts of interventions that we're doing. If they get noticed, they get put in a different category. For example, like DIY bike lanes. If you're going to go out and paint your own bike lane in the city, you don't want that to get noticed, because if it gets noticed, it gets erased or it doesn't get respected. You want it to just blend into the infrastructure of the city. When we're working, we have our choice of materials. The cheapest thing to work with is data. If we can just change what people know about a city, that's really lightweight, that's really easy. If you want to then say, okay, well, we're going to go to some space, we're going to project light into that space, or sound or that kind of thing, that's still very, very lightweight in a literal sense. It can be a lot easier, but it's kind of the next step. Paint, whether it's a bike lane or graffiti or decals or whatever, is sort of your next layer. Fabric or deployable structures, things that you can put up very quickly and take down very quickly, are the sort of the next level of weight, the next level of involvement there. And then we get into real buildings, when you're actually building something real that's going to last in the city. That's a very powerful intervention, but it's also a relatively expensive one. So let's look at some examples. Some of these are theoretical, some of these are things which have actually been done. The intent is to give you guys an idea of the range of things that you can do in a city as individuals. The first that we're going to look at are examples based around mapping the city, changing how people navigate the city, directly working on people's imaginaries of the city. Urban exploration is an interesting example of this because it's not something that people normally think about as intervening in the city. But when you go, explore steam tunnels or all of these other places, abandoned buildings, you're recreating the city as a place of wonder. As you talk about that, as you tell people about these stories, it's, oh, hey, did you know that there's this place that you can go? That changes how people see the city pretty directly. Exploration doesn't have to be breaking into abandoned buildings. It can be as simple as breaking out of your routines. We all have these very set routes that we fall into in the city. Go to a different cafe, go somewhere else, talk to other people. Learn as many of the facets of your city as you can and, become a bridge between communities. That kind of exploration changes the structure of the city because it means that all of these other people that you're talking to know people from outside those communities. Various city games and things of that category can fall into this, geocaching, letterboxing, that kind of thing. The idea of a psychogeographic walk is going for a walk in the city randomly, flip a coin or roll a die each time you get to a corner, and you just kind of walk this random route through the city, and you explore places that you've never seen before because they're never places that you would think to go otherwise. There are existing communities around urban exploration, which I would advise you to seek out if you're interested in this. Augmented reality is interesting as a form of architecture. The idea of augmented reality is overlaying video onto, overlaying data onto some video or some, like you have, you hold your phone up and you see it as a window and you see something that's not there. It's a bit more expensive than just looking, but It lets you do things like you can see buildings that aren't there. Someone wrote an application where if you've got an iPhone and you're walking around Lower Manhattan, you can see the World Trade Center. It's just virtually rebuilt, which is actually a pretty powerful statement. You can use this to visualize buildings that aren't there yet. Let's say developers put up some nice fancy renderings for some big project that's going in, and you actually locate those in space, and then you get a much better idea that, oh yeah, no, that's actually gonna overshadow all these buildings and really change the feel of this area in the city in a way that was completely not obvious from the drawings that were presented. So this can become a location of community awareness and community gathering. You can have very lightweight applications that are still on this continuum, things that are just mobile apps that don't do video overlays. Fix My Street in the UK is an interesting example of this, where it gives you this really trivial way from a mobile phone to submit to the local municipality, hey, there's a pothole here you need to fix, that kind of thing. So it brings that into space. It kind of generates that sort of community awareness and involvement. You can use AR to tell stories. It's a great storytelling medium. It's kind of problematic in some ways in the city, though, because it is very class divisive. When you use AR, you are restricting yourself to the people who can afford smartphones and data plans, which is not everyone. And when you buy into those goods, you buy into this kind of consumptive mindset that goes along with them. So it can be a very good tool. It can be an iffy tool. You can use things like 2D barcodes and this idea of like functional graffiti that links to resources directly as a lighter weight way of doing the same kind of thing. We don't know what's in our cities. There are a lot of resources in cities. They're very rich places, but it's hard to find a lot of this stuff. So a map can be a way to change people's understanding of the city. There's the fallen fruit map in LA, and it basically is a map of fruit trees that overgrow public spaces. In California, any fruit tree that's growing over a public space is public property. You can eat the fruit on it. So this is a map of all those spaces, so all of a sudden those are resources, and that people can actually find without having to spend a lot of time hunting. So this is a way of very directly changing how people understand the city, breaking down those barriers of who knows what. Public art can change cities. That's a pretty direct way of operating on the imaginary of the city. A good art piece can stop you in your tracks, especially when it's presented outside of this kind of sanctified museum space or commercial gallery space. Getting permission can rob that kind of art of power. Not getting permission also changes the reception and can make it a lot more negative. There's this kind of, balance that you have to walk there. Temporary art pieces can be pretty productive there. If you're doing something very lightweight with light or, chalk or that kind of thing, it can sometimes still have a lot of that effect. You do a lot more work for the same number of impressions, but, maybe you get better impressions. In 1913 in Berlin, there was a really interesting book published called What a Woman Must Know About Berlin, which was an introduction to how to interact with the city as a modern woman, which was a really revolutionary idea at the time. It had resources listed in there, but it was mostly about, literally, this is how you can use the city. You could create the hacker's guidebook to cities or a city in the same way. This is how you can interact with this city. This is, these are the ways that you can interact with these spaces. These are the resources that you can look for. This is this way of thinking about the city. This is an explicit introduction to this imaginary of the city. So infrastructure, semi-legal Wi-Fi, information is citizenship. When we access information, we access the life of our city. In a lot of ways, if you can't get online, you can't really live in modern society. And increasingly, if you can't get online when you're out and about, you can't live in the city. But that's expensive to do. So free mobile access is a way of kind of democratizing the spaces in which it's available. It doesn't deal with having space to use that. It doesn't deal with the availability of hardware, especially if you're just providing Wi-Fi. But it's a first step, and it's a cheap and easy first step. Establishing point-to-point links for nonprofits, letting people get online that it would be a stretch to, pay for that kind of bill is another thing that you can do, which is this